Who's next in line in King Saul's kingdom? Saul's son is Jonathan. Smack it out of the park. I'm throwing it up for you all right now. Jonathan is, when we look at the stories of Jonathan, is Jonathan a proud, aggressive, worldly kind of person like his father? Jonathan has all the makings of what looking like would be a great king. But even Jonathan recognizes that when God says the kingdom is taken from his father's hand, he's not going to step in the way of God's plans, of what God is doing and God's accomplishing. And so we see here's a man who's so consumed with proud, and God brings him down. And here's a man of humility like Jonathan, who rather than being exalted doesn't get to that position, but is a man who is following God and serves God in that regard. Other people we might think, Glenn?
When I think of these verses here, there's a lot of people today that are oppressors. They get the gain of the world, and even people envy them because they're successful. And what God is teaching us is they will get their due someday. And in verse 3, we're to be merciful and let that hang about our neck. And it's just, there are people that will be evil and they will succeed in this world, but don't envy them.
Yeah. Verse 31 was one of those that if I had a question, one of my questions, why would I envy an oppressor? Why would I envy a violent person? But I think we can recognize that, hopefully they're not thoughts that we dwell on too long, but we see some of that. We see some people who, we read the Proverbs that say things like, the wicked have their judgment brought upon them and the righteous are blessed. But you also see those Proverbs where there are wicked people who succeed and righteous people end up defending themselves, being persecuted or killed. But God ultimately is in control of all these things, and God brings about judgment. And part of God's wisdom and part of walking God's way we see throughout the history of his people is that will you stay faithful to him even in those oppressive, even in those difficult persecution kind of times, even in those times when other people are getting success when we're not seeing that. And that's such an important point to be remembered here as well. Maybe a little bit easier question to think about is some of this is very much talking about God and mentioning him, mentioning the Lord. What does this text teach us about God? We see verse 19 and verse 20, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. It might seem like a basic kind of question. It might seem like a beginner's question since it goes back to the beginning. But it's always important to remind ourselves of whose universe is this? It's not man's. It's not Solomon's. It's not Egypt or anyone else's. It's God. God created all of this, and God makes all of this work. That's where books like Ecclesiastes and Job and Proverbs all kind of meld together, kind of the central holding point of God has made this, God has ruled this universe, and we need to live according to his ways. And when we break that, we start to see issues. Or when we start to question him as he does that and think that he's not good in that, he helps us to understand and see there's a lot of things that we don't know what we don't know that are outside of our scope of thinking and understanding. And there's a lot of trust that goes into this as well. What are we learning about God from this chapter? He loves us. And that should not go unstated. And the fact that when we look at this chapter, we're not just talking about Proverbs, wisdom is great, you've got to work hard, you've got to see all these things. God wants what's best for man and loves man. Is there a particular passage or a particular verse that stands out to you? Glow? Let's get down here. Let's see some of these things. Thinking about Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 25. Do not be afraid of sudden terror or of the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. There's some thoughts in there. Even the verse before, verse 24, if you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Kind of echoing some thoughts from Psalm 3 and verse 5, I lay down and slept, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. Even things like, if you go to bed tonight and Lord willing, you wake up tomorrow morning, that's because the Lord has shown you grace and shown you a gift of having the next day and giving you blessing of the next day's life and giving you a chance to live in his world and live and walk in that wisdom. What else are we seeing about God and learning about him in this chapter? There's security, confidence, all those psalms, all those phrases we think of. God is our refuge, our fortress, our shield, All of those thoughts come within all of this idea. And when does that idea meet to us really comprehending that? It's one thing to say that God is my fortress and shield. It's another thing for me to actually understand and live through that because I'm choosing to live by his wisdom, right? There's a difference between me just saying God is my shield and I have security, I have dwellings because of all the peace that I just feel and make up for myself, as opposed to I'm walking in God's way of wisdom and I know that he's my shield and my refuge. And I have a confidence of that because I'm walking the path that he's laid before me. There's a different kind of hope and confidence within those things. And hope we recognize what God is talking about is that we're already choosing to walk in his ways. Anything else we're learning about God in this chapter? Anything else that stands out to us before we move on? All right, so this gives us about 12 minutes or so to think about the question we really want to spend some time thinking about, which is, what is this text, or what is God teaching us in this text? Not the main point I want to hang on to, but something I noticed as we were in verses 26. Look at verse 27 and verse 28. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 27 and verse 28. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come again, tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you today. That idea of it being with you right now. In the previous chapter, we saw in Proverbs chapter 1, or Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 1, my son, if you receive my words and you treasure up my commandments with you. Some of your versions will say, store up wisdom at the end of verse 1, or something similar to that. The idea of we are to store up wisdom. We're supposed to take hold of wisdom, take note of wisdom. Not all wisdom is going to be used right now in this moment. Sometimes wisdom is knowing this is the moment. I've got that judgment, discernment to see this is a time now that I've learned about in our Proverbs class. This is something I learned about a long time ago when Glow taught me in Bible class or something like that. And now I'm recognizing this is the point I need to put that into action and apply that in rubber meeting the road. We need to have the wisdom to actually use wisdom, and rather than having wisdom to just store up wisdom. There may be times that we feel that we store up wisdom and we're holding on to it. And as it's talked about here in verse 27 and verse 28, it's thinking about not just letting things pass on when the opportunity is right there to do good. When you have the chance right there in that moment to your neighbor. Maybe we're specifically thinking about our brethren, we're thinking about our family, we're thinking about our friends. I think we could even go to Luke chapter 10. What's the story of Luke chapter 10 about that Jesus tells that kind of gets to this idea of who is my neighbor? What's the parable there with that? The good Samaritan in that story there. And understanding that the neighbor is the one who showed mercy. That if we have the opportunity to show mercy, and we use that wisdom as a discerning way to show mercy in a moment, then that's what we should be doing. We should not be holding on to our wisdom, holding on to ourselves when good has an opportunity to present itself and we choose to pass it on. Makes me think of another passage in James chapter 2. Let's get a little bit of James chapter 2 with this as well. Barrett, would you mind doing some James 2 reading for us this evening? I'll let you know what I need you to do in just a second. Again, James draws a lot from the ideas of Proverbs and seems to, some people will say James is kind of the wisdom book of the New Testament. He's kind of like the Proverbs book of the New Testament. It's also kind of like the Sermon on the Mount, the very much redacted version, or kind of very much reduced version, I should say. A lot of the teachings of his half-brother Jesus, lots of wisdom he distills into the life of Christians. Barrett, would you mind getting James 2? Let's just do verse 14 through verse 17, please.
What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
So, kind of an illustration, I think James is dovetailing 2 points. He's talked about the way that we treat other people and kind of the section before this, and he's getting more into faith without works, but kind of connecting those 2 ideas here and seeing that, we're very familiar, I think, with the idea that faith without works is dead. Use that illustration then as just as somebody who says, it'll be all right, you can take care of yourself, you'll figure things out, it'll go along the way, when we have an opportunity in that moment. And that's something to notice again about Proverbs chapter 3 in verse 27. when it says, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, what is in your power to do it. It takes some wisdom to know that, hey, right now is not my time to do this. Right now is not my chance that I have abundance to give from. But there is a time that I will have abundance to give from, Lord willing, and hopefully I will have wisdom to do so and to treat my neighbor with love and with care within some of that. That's one thing that stood out to me when reading Proverbs chapter 3. But I really want to go back and spend the rest of our time in Proverbs 3, verse 1 through verse 7, reminding ourselves of these and thinking about the question of not just what is the Lord teaching us, but kind of the thought of what does this look like lived out? What does this look like maybe from different Bible characters that you think of? What does this look at if we want to actually apply it to our lives? The ideas we read about here in Proverbs 3, verse 1 through verse 7. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. What does that look like in a practical, because we really want to have a strong point to end our class on this evening. What does that look like as we're going to leave this evening, as we're going to go through the rest of this week? What might that look like in our personal devotion time? What might we be doing as we think about some of those thoughts from those particular chapters? Adding to our knowledge? How are we adding to our knowledge? I watch a lot of YouTube, Danny. And I watch a lot of YouTube when I need help with electrical things. I watch a lot of cat videos on YouTube too. But that's not the type of knowledge I think we're talking about here. Adding to our knowledge how? Knowledge of God's Word, binding that on our hearts, writing that there, hanging that around our neck. I don't think we need to get, this little kids' classroom here has Bibles that are about this big and have, I think, all of Genesis through at least Leviticus in there and what must be 0.01 font. But I don't think that's what we need to have wrapped around our neck. The idea is that we're using the knowledge and applying it into our lives and growing in that knowledge. What's why we think about from these passages here? What do they look like as we go throughout our daily life? Can you think of any Bible characters that exhibit this kind of characteristic, these types of thoughts? It's going to flood. And yet, to stay focused on that task, to not listen to what we understand the words of other people who were deriding him or saying he was crazy and all of that, something that had never happened before. Noah is certainly somebody who trusts in the Lord with all of his heart and chose to not lean on his own understanding. I don't mean to imply negative things into Bible stories that aren't there, and so I recognize, and hopefully you recognize, that these are assumptions, but just based on my own life experiences, and maybe some of your life experiences, you can relate to this too. Somewhere there was a little voice in Noah that said, why am I swinging this hammer again? But there was a louder voice and a much more important voice in Noah's life that said, because God said you need to build this ark, and that God said the judgment is coming, and you need to be prepared for that. So even if there was, and I'm not saying there is for certain, even if there was that little voice at some point that said, Noah, why don't you just go take a break? Why don't you go play with the boys today? You've been doing this for 96 years. Maybe you can take a day off today. No, Noah's recognized what he needed to do and trusted in the Lord in that regard. What else? Maybe some other characters or other things we see as this. What does this look like in our lives to not be wise in our own eyes, to acknowledge God, to let steadfast love and faithfulness being bound around our neck and written on the tablets of our heart? What does that look like? Aaron? You had a pinky going up, so go ahead. I saw your hand over there, so He gave me a thumbs up. It looks like a thumbs up this week. Aaron, what does that look like? You're a big boy in Bible class. What do you think? What does that look like in our lives when we are setting our hearts on God's commandments? How do we do that? What does that look like?
Well, I think that like the perfect example, obviously, is Jesus, and I think that. Hold on a second. One thing I have to pull down. I think it was verse 25. Or no, 35. So I just like the wise will inherit honor, but fools increase dishonor. And I think that that's like a perfect thing to see is like we can choose one or two sides in this world, and we shouldn't be any different way towards the people that are acting differently and not following God's law, and just stay around the people that are following the law. And so I think that that's a perfect thing that God's teaching is we need to treat the people that aren't following the Bible the exact same way as we treat these people here.
I think there's some points in there to see, recognize how we live and the type of example we would have with other people. And also, Jesus is always going to be a good answer to see if we think about what does this look like. Does it look like to trust in the Lord with all your heart and not lean on your own understanding? It looks like being nailed to a piece of wood, even though that may not have been what you expected your Friday night to be like. Now, understanding that's what God's will is in this moment, and that's what we're going to choose to do. It's a great example of that. Barrett?
Verse 6, in all your ways acknowledge him. And verse 9, honor the Lord with your possessions. This isn't just what we do here. I mean, this is how we live our life every day. So we've got to be familiar with the scriptures, be reminding ourselves, be reading it again and again, so we can conclude from what we're reading that, hey, this applies in this way to this circumstance, or how I just need to be around people, how I need to treat people. And it just applies to not just what we do here, obviously, it applies to everything.
We'll recognize that we can go back to Proverbs 3 tomorrow, and we'll come back and spend some time here, and maybe we'll spend some time in Hebrews getting ready for our Sunday morning class, or we'll read Proverbs 4 for next week. We'll read, maybe we've got already kind of our own reading plan. We're somewhere in the prophets or in the Gospels. Continue to go back to God's Word and see the wisdom of it, and recognizing then, like Barrett says, of not just, how's that going to help me fill in dead space and awkward silence in a Wednesday night Bible class discussion, but how is that important to my life as a father, or my life as a teacher, as an employer, as someone who is bringing up children, as someone who is a spouse, as someone who is living out my community, wanting to have interactions with people who are not yet Christians and helping them to show them the truth, and maybe being that example and that light along the way. God's wisdom helps us to have that. But that means we need to have God's wisdom with us. And that might be helpful. I mean, if you want to carry a Bible with you all the time, that might be helpful. The idea is we're carrying it in our hearts and our minds and using it in our lives constantly throughout our day. Not just here, but as we go through traffic, as we go through our work, as we go through deep conversations with our loved ones, with our enemies even, and choosing God's way rather than our own way, and trusting in Him and trusting in the value of His wisdom as well. I haven't really hit those, but verse 14, the gain of wisdom is better than the gain from silver, and the profit is better than gold, and she's more precious than jewels. But those are impressive thoughts upon us, not to say, wow, I could sell my Bible at a pawn shop to get some pretty good values. The point is to say that there's a lot of value in our life spiritually. There's lots of things for us to take and to note and to say long term, the things that really matter in this life, right? Probably all seen some article, heard some story, talked to some older fellow, and talked to them about, what, if you could go back, or what was really important to you. Very few people are saying it was my N64 and my copy of Super Mario Kart or things like that. It was, my old little toy ship. It was my family. It was my people. It was my faith. These are things that were very important to me. And seeing how God's will impacted how I relate to those things in my life on a daily basis, hopefully those are the things we'll hold on to and take with as we move on from our studies this evening. Excuse me. So next week, we'll continue on in Proverbs chapter 4, particularly thinking about the idea of generational wisdom. Proverbs chapter 4 begins with, "Hear, O sons of fathers' instruction." In verse 3, "When I was a son, my father tender, the only one in the inside of my mother, he taught me and said to me," and told him wisdom. The father who's saying things to his son in Proverbs 1 through 9 we think about this personification story, is not just, some guy who's hacking on his son. He's somebody who knows what really works in life because he's seen it and lived it and wants us to pay attention to those things as well. So hopefully we'll pay attention to generational wisdom and the right way next week. Thank you so much for your comments and for your attention this evening.